A journalist asked Freddie Mercury if he believed he was going to heaven. He laughed. "No," he said, "I don't want to. Hell is much better. Look at the interesting people you're going to meet down there." It sounds like a punchline. It was not delivered as one. The man saying it already knew privately that the question was not hypothetical. The journalist's name was David Wigg, and by the time he asked that question, he was not really a journalist to Freddie anymore. Wigg had made his name a decade earlier interviewing the Beatles, one of the very few reporters any of them actually trusted. Somewhere along the way, he became one of the very few reporters Freddie trusted too. Most interviewers got performance. Wigg got something closer to conversation. That trust did not appear overnight. It was built the same way it had been built with the Beatles, over years, session after session, long before anybody involved knew which conversations would end up mattering. Wigg was not chasing a single explosive quote. He kept coming back, kept talking, kept letting Freddie set the pace. By the time the two of them sat down in Munich in 1985, they were not stranger and subject anymore. They were two men who had known each other a long time, one of whom happened to be holding a tape recorder. That distinction matters more than it sounds like it should. Freddie gave hundreds of interviews across his career, and in almost all of them he was working, deflecting, performing, controlling exactly how much of himself made it onto the page. He built an entire public persona partly to have somewhere safe to stand while cameras were on him. With Wigg, across several sessions recorded over the years, some of that control came down. The most consequential of those conversations happened in Munich in 1985. Freddie was there working on his first solo album, Mr. Bad Guy, and Wigg came to talk about one song specifically, a ballad called Made in Heaven. Nobody in that room could have known what that title would eventually mean. On the surface, it was a normal promotional conversation. A journalist, an artist, a new record to talk up. But Wigg had earned enough trust that the conversation kept sliding sideways, into territory a normal press interview would never reach. Freddie talked about his relationships, about what it actually cost to be watched by that many people at once, about a rumor that had started circulating in the industry, quietly, about a virus that was beginning to frighten everybody in his circle. He did not confirm anything about his own health in that recording, but the subject was clearly already sitting in the room with them. Munich itself was not a random choice of location, either. By the mid-'80s, Freddie was spending long stretches of time there, recording, socializing, living a version of his life that was harder for the British press to track closely. It gave him room. Fewer photographers outside the hotel, fewer people who recognized him on the street, a city where he could exist for a while as something closer to a private person. It is a small detail, but it says something about the kind of conversation that could happen there. A quieter city produced a quieter, more honest interview than London ever seemed to. There is a quote from these sessions that has outlived almost everything else Freddie ever said to a journalist. Asked in some form whether he worried about being remembered after he died, he said, "I don't really think when I'm dead are they going to remember me. It's up to them. When I'm dead, who cares? I don't." Said flatly, not bitter, not performing sadness for the microphone. Just a genuinely indifferent answer to a question most famous people spend their whole careers pretending to have a noble response to. Compare that to how he talked about the band staying together. In one of the Wigg conversations, he said something close to, "Through everything, we will just carry on. It's a survival instinct the whole group has. I mean, if I just left, they would replace me. Not easy to replace me, though." There is real fondness under the joke, and something else, too, a kind of rehearsal. He was talking about the band surviving without him years before anybody else in the room was ready to say that sentence out loud. It is worth remembering what Queen actually was by 1985, because it changes how that comment lands. They were not a young band anymore, feeling each other out. They had been together for well over a decade, through arena tour, through Live Aid that same year, through albums that had made and occasionally nearly broken them as a group. Talking casually about being replaced was not insecurity. It was the kind of joke four people make only after they have already survived enough together to know exactly how unlikely it actually was. None of this reached the public at the time as anything alarming. The Wigg interviews were not treated as a deathbed confession, because as far as the outside world knew, there was nothing to confess. Freddie had not gone public with an AIDS diagnosis, and would not for years. Journalists who heard these tapes, if they heard them at all, filed them as an unusually candid pop star being funny about mortality in the abstract. It reads completely differently once you know what was actually happening underneath the conversation. That gap between what the tape sounds like and what was actually true is the whole reason these interviews still get watched and listened to today. Most celebrity interview archives age into trivia. These aged into something closer to a document. Not because Freddie said anything he wasn't supposed to say, but because he said ordinary things while carrying information nobody else in the room had, and you can hear it if you know to listen for it. He was not being reckless with the truth, either. He was extremely disciplined about what he actually revealed. Freddie kept his diagnosis private for years, protected by a small circle, denying it directly to reporters who asked outright. The Wigg interviews sit right at the edge of that wall without ever actually going through it, close enough that you can feel the pressure of what he was not saying. That kind of control, holding a conversation open and warm while guarding one specific fact inside it, is its own performance, arguably harder than any stage show. The public finally learned the truth on the 23rd of November, 1991. Freddie issued a statement confirming he had AIDS. He died the following day. The interval between the two was less than 24 hours, which meant the world found out he was sick and that he was dead in almost the same breath, with no time in between to process either one separately. Everything Wigg had gently circled around in Munich 6 years earlier suddenly had a name and an ending. Journalists who had those Munich tapes sitting in a drawer must have understood within hours exactly what they were now holding. Recordings of a man joking about heaven and hell, about being forgotten, about the band carrying on without him, made years before anyone outside his closest circle knew why any of it was on his mind. Interviews like that do not stay ordinary once the context changes. They become evidence of something the subject knew and the world did not. And then, in 1995, something happened that nobody involved in that '85 interview could have planned. The three surviving members of Queen released one final album, built from vocals Freddie had recorded in his last years, finished around him after he was gone. They called it Made in Heaven, the same title as the song he had sat with David Wigg to discuss, a decade earlier, in a hotel room in Munich, while carefully not saying the one thing that conversation was really about. It is worth being precise about what that title actually is, because the coincidence is real, but it is not mystical. Freddie wrote and released Made in Heaven as a solo single in 1985. Queen deliberately borrowed that title for the posthumous album a decade later as a direct callback to his own work, not an accident of naming. But knowing it was deliberate does not make it land any softer. A song he discussed with a trusted journalist while quietly living inside a secret became, after his death, the name attached to his actual goodbye. Listen to the recordings now, knowing how the story ends, and the jokes change shape entirely. Hell is much better. Look at the interesting people you'll meet down there. Stops being a throwaway line about heaven and starts sounding like a man giving himself permission to not be afraid of the one thing he could not control. When I'm dead, who cares? I don't. Stops sounding indifferent and starts sounding like armor. A way of getting through a question that could otherwise have cracked him open in front of a tape recorder. David Wigg kept those tapes for decades. Some material was released publicly around what would have been Freddie's 60th birthday, packaged as an audio collection built from years of conversations, giving people direct access to the sound of Freddie's own voice reflecting on his life, rather than someone else's account of it. For a man who spent a professional lifetime controlling exactly how the public got to know him, that release is a rare thing. His own unguarded voice, still talking, years after everyone already knew how the story ended. Compare that with how most posthumous celebrity material actually reaches the public. Usually it arrives second-hand. A biographer's paraphrase, a bandmate's memory of a conversation, a documentary narrator summarizing what somebody once said. Each retelling moves a little further from the original moment. The Wigg tapes skip all of that. It is his actual voice, his actual timing, his actual laugh landing exactly where he chose to put it. Nobody standing between the listener and Freddie deciding, in real time, how to answer a question about his own death. There is a version of celebrity journalism that is mostly noise. Quotes engineered for headlines, questions designed to provoke rather than reveal. The David Wigg interviews are the opposite of that, and they are valuable for exactly the reason they are quiet. Nobody was trying to catch Freddie out. He was simply talking to somebody he had decided, over years, that he trusted, and some of what came out in that trust turned out to matter enormously later, in ways neither man could have predicted at the time.